The $500 billion traffic jam. Why the Mississippi River is about to collapse America's economy. The tows were already cut in half when the call came, draft down to 10 feet, convoys ordered, rates spiking, and $500 billion of cargo staring at sand. The river hadn't failed, it had shrunk. Here's the promise: we'll show you who quietly decides who moves and who waits when there isn't enough river for everyone. The hidden plan, the triage, and the lie that made this inevitable. Get this, the locks that were supposed to protect the system aren't backups at all. They're single points of failure. Who knew, how long, and why did they let it slide? 3 reveals in 5 minutes. The lie, the human stake, the origin. Exposing the hidden dependency. Start with what moves and why inches matter. Grain, fuel, fertilizer, the invisible conveyor belt sliding south through steel boxes lashed in squares of 15. In a normal year, a tow works like a floating factory floor, 15 barges, about 26,000 tons in one push, gliding toward Gulf elevators that feed the world. When water drops, that factory gets dismantled in place. Smaller tows, shallower drafts. Each barge sacrificed ton by ton to avoid the river's teeth. Every lost inch of draft means millions evaporate along the corridor. The math is brutal because the Mississippi is the cheapest way to move bulk on land-linked water. That's why nearly half of US corn and soybean exports start here. A single tow replaces 1,000 trucks. It's not romance, it's fuel, friction, and payroll. Barge transport saves billions a year compared to rail or truck in normal conditions. But that advantage is razor-thin on margin. Nudge the waterline down and cost per ton jumps. That jump doesn't stay on the water. It lands on farm receipts, grocery shelves, and export bids. Here's the lie: resilience. We were told redundancy exists, that if the river stumbles, rail and trucking will catch the load. It sounds sensible until you try it at scale. A 15-barge tow is 2 unit trains or 1,000 semis. Multiply that across weeks of harvest, and you don't have a safety net. You have fantasy. When tow sizes shrink and draft caps hit, southbound volume plunges. In drought seasons, shipments have fallen by more than half in weeks, and rates have surged from the teens toward the mid-20s per ton on key reaches. Elevators downstream slow receipts. Upstream bids weaken. Basis blows out. The backstop never arrives because the backstop doesn't exist at the price the system needs. Meanwhile, something else is happening. The river is rationed quietly, not by policy, but by physics and wallet. Draft restrictions and tow width limits are the first cut. Then come convoy orders through the worst shoals, move in narrow windows, one at a time. Dredges hustle to carve a pass that shifts with every wind gust and tributary pulse. The practical result is a line where money buys position. Who can afford to wait with a perishable cargo? Who can absorb a demurrage bill? Who can pay the premium to move now? The river never posts a price tag on that triage, but everyone on it can feel the hand on the scale. Underneath, the design is part of the trap. The upper Mississippi's lock system fixed a meandering river to a set of 1930s geometries, 9 feet, 600-foot chambers, gates and gear that assumed smaller tows, shorter queues, and gentler variability. The locks weren't built as buffers, they were built as thresholds. When a mitre gate cracks or a sill crumbles, everything stops. A single failed hinge can strand hundreds of barges in a day. That's not redundancy. That's a single point of failure, multiplied by 29. Ask the pilots who thread giant tows through 600-foot boxes with 1,200-foot dreams. If a tow doesn't fit, you break it in 2, lock through twice, and put it back together. That doubles the time and compounds delay downstream. Now add aging steel, custom fabricated parts, and maintenance windows pushed into later seasons because funding lags and traffic can't stop. You get a system that can't sprint when the water briefly rises and can't glide when it falls. Commodity markets already price this risk. Basis along the river moves like a seismograph. Insurers write clauses for low water delays. Force majeure language creeps into contracts. Exporters hedge loadings to the Pacific Northwest. But in public, the story is steadiness. Keep calm, dredging will handle it. Dredging is a shovel chasing a treadmill. In low flow, sediment drops where you least want it. Crews dig one crossing open and another pinches shut. Upper districts juggle sand islands, permits, and protests over spoil sites. Lower reaches blow sand back into the Talweg, and hope the current keeps it down. All of it is expensive, and none of it changes the baseline geometry. Here's where things get interesting. The cost signals concentrate power. Elevated barge rates don't fold evenly across the map. A multinational can pivot elevation points, blend rail where feasible, and pass on costs. A small elevator on a side channel can't. Farmers within that catchment eat the base's collapse. Grain that would have flowed to the Gulf waits in bins. Cash flows thin at the exact moment seed and loan payments come due. A 10-foot cap at Memphis is an invoice in Iowa. To understand why the lie persists, go upstream past the tow knees and the queue boards to the budget tables. The Inland Waterways Trust Fund covers a slice of new construction, but maintenance, the thing that actually keeps the gates moving and channels open, lives on annual appropriations. Short-term money chases long-term metal. Meanwhile, any fix that would match modern loads, 200-foot locks, deeper channels, runs into a wall of cost, time, permits, and local objections. So the system lives on patches. The patches create the myth of resilience because for a while they work. Then a dry September arrives, and the myth collapses back into physics. What nobody knew at the time, at least nobody outside dispatch offices and insurance desks, was how fast the risk was compounding. 4 straight harvest seasons saw historically low river stages along key gauges. Restrictions came earlier, queues got longer, rates climbed sooner. Exporters at the Gulf watched lineups thin, while Brazil and Argentina stepped into the gap. During one of those seasons, Louisiana's export volumes dipped noticeably in the second half, hundreds of millions in lost sales, a sliver of the corridor's scale, but a sharp signal. Reliability matters as much as price. Meanwhile, the lower river faced a threat that wasn't on most barge rate sheets, the saltwater wedge. When flows drop hard, denser Gulf water creeps upriver, threatening municipal intakes. Cities start planning for barge-delivered freshwater while grain tows idle upriver. Navigation and drinking water move from separate categories to the same emergency meeting. Who gets priority? The law has answers. The river has its own. The insurance market reads this like weather. Premiums tilt. Deductibles climb for low water seasons. Contracts tighten force majeure definitions. Credit lines to small operators get conservative. Behavior shifts. Shippers preemptively lighten drafts to avoid grounding headlines. That means more trips for the same volume, and again the cheap food model erodes in the details. More fuel per ton, more crews, more delays. There's one detail that will matter later, the 9-foot promise. The entire upper system is designed around guaranteeing a 9-foot navigation channel. It was a boast of mid-century engineering, and it worked until climate variability tightened and demand scaled beyond the intended envelope. Now that promise functions like a legal fiction under stress. The Corps fights to honor it with dredges and directives. The river voids it in stretches with wind pushes and sandbars. The promise is still on paper. The price for keeping it rises every season. Parallel to all this, the public story remains cautious. Announcements cite draft restrictions, escort protocols, and safety. The live story on a towboat is different. A pilot listening to the hull bump gravel and calculating whether a few inches will grind the fleet to a halt. A dispatcher bargaining for a daylight slot through a problem reach. A terminal manager deciding whether to post a bid that forces farmers to hold or dump. In those rooms, resilience sounds like a joke you tell to get through a shift. Here's the quiet part. The system rations by delay, not decree. Delay moves money. It redistributes risk down the chain to whoever can least carry it. Every hour tow sits, the cost of that hour flows through the lowest margin link first. A trucker waiting to deliver to a jammed elevator eats the clock. A farmer who can't unload eats the basis. A small barge line without multiple contracts eats the idle crew. The corridor functions like a market, but the clearing price is time. So who knew and how long? Pilots, dispatchers, and engineers have known for years. The data told it. Block delays growing from minutes to hours, maintenance backlogs measured in billions, age profiles that look like museum inventories. Commodity traders priced it in when basis volatility became a harvest season ritual. The public only sees the headlines when the river hits a record low and photos show barges marooned on sand. Then rain falls, the river rises, and the story resets. Until the next trough. This was the moment everything changed, not a disaster, but a recognition. The Mississippi's cheap and reliable advantage was conditional, and those conditions were fading. Still, the narrative clung to the idea that redundancy would save the day. Rail would flex, trucks would flood in, but crews were tight, yards congested, diesel expensive, and unit train slots already spoken for. You can't conjure thousands of trucks and hundreds of engineers overnight. You can only pay more and move less. In the aftermath of each low-water season, proposals circulate. More dredging funding, fast-tracked rehab, a 1,200-foot chamber here, a deeper cut there. They matter, they buy time, but they don't change the core dependency. The single artery that moves the cheapest calories on Earth depends on 9 feet of depth and iron built in the New Deal. That's the lie exposed. Resilience isn't a system property here. It's a story we tell between droughts. If the numbers don't move you, meet the people who live and die by inches of water. Lives on a draft line. Meet Jake, 30 years on the wheel, knees polished by nerves and habit. He's paid by movement, not hours, and this season the river cut his year in half. Groundings turned into convoys. 10 feet of draft meant shaving cargo till the tow looked like a ribcage. He counts inches out loud because every inch is fuel, time, and pay. When the dispatch orders convoying through a shoal, he idles in a queue and watches dollars burn. The call that matters is the one that says, "You're moving," and some weeks it never comes. 3 days earlier, a farmer named Elise stood in a grain elevator office, staring at a board that kept blinking delayed receipts. Basis widened by the hour. The river was slow, bids dropped, and the elevator capped intake to keep from choking on inventory it couldn't push south. Her bins were already full from a bigger-than-expected yield. She ran the math: haul to a distant rail loader at a painful discount, or wait and pray the river comes back before the corn turns. Waiting means interest ticking on the operating loan, seed invoices due, and a banker who doesn't care what the St. Louis gauge says. Meanwhile, something else was happening in a town upriver. The fleeting yard where Jake ties off between runs, pays city taxes, sponsors the high school team, keeps a diner open past dark. When tow work thins, shifts disappear. The school superintendent watches sales tax revenue sag and starts a list: unfilled teaching positions, postponed bus purchases, deferred roof repairs. The hospital CFO moves new ultrasound into next year because barge season slipped into maybe. What nobody outside these rooms sees is how fertilizer misses become next year's yield losses. Elise's agronomist texts: barges delayed, spring delivery windows squeezed, prices creeping. Spread the wrong week, and your corn's hungry when it should be sprinting. Lost bushels are invisible until they're not. The river's low today steals next year's revenue quietly. Here's where it gets interesting. The cheapest calories on Earth hang on 9 feet of depth, and the people who produce them live on a draft line. Jake knows the feel of gravel under steel the way a violinist knows a string. Elise knows that a 10-cent basis hit is a mortgage payment gone. They don't speak in climate models. They speak in tow width, demurrage, bin space, and cash flow. Unknown to them, across town, a small elevator manager named Rob refreshes a dredging notice like it's weather radar. He's got farmers stacked in trucks down the road, a leg that can't run 24 hours without a breakdown crew he can't afford, and a barge slot that moved twice in 2 days. If he closes intake, he becomes the villain. If he stays open, he risks piling grain on promises he can't keep. He calls his insurer to check force majeure language and hates himself for even thinking it. While that was happening in Memphis, a city engineer was mapping the saltwater wedge's slow push upriver. Intake protections, temporary pipelines, the awful calculus of who gets priority if the wedge reaches the mouth. Every contingency meeting shoved grain to the margin and moved drinking water to the front. Jake hears about it in a canal-side bar. Elise hears about it on the farm radio between market updates. Both understand the same thing. When the river is rationed, their place in line is fragile. Micro-stories multiply. A deckhand buys a second-hand car because his hours disappeared, then sells it 2 months later to pay rent. A trucker sleeps in his cab at a jammed elevator, waiting 12 hours to dump because barge arrivals slipped again. A parts machinist custom fabricates a miter gate hinge on a rush order and misses his kid's game. The hinge ships, the lock holds, the queue shrinks by inches. This was the moment everything changed for them, not on a headline but in a ledger. Jake took a run he shouldn't have, lighter than ever, just to keep his crew whole. Elise sold into a bruised basis to make a payment and swallowed the lump in her throat. Their choices were rational. The system made them cruel. The historical context: a river straitjacketed. To understand why Jake and Elise live on inches, we need to go back to when the river was told to hold still. In the 1930s, Congress ordered a promise into the current, a 9-foot navigation channel on the upper Mississippi. Engineers answered with concrete, steel, and confidence, 29 locks and dams from Minneapolis to Granite City. Pools were created, the river laddered, and a meandering artery was forced into calibrated steps. The ethos was simple: standardize depth, fix the channel, build the locks, and commerce will follow. It did, but the geometry they chose, 600-foot lock chambers, mid-century gates, roller mechanisms, matched a different era. Tows were smaller, traffic lighter, variability gentler. The system wasn't designed to stretch, it was designed to hold. Lifespan assumptions hovered around 50 years. We are past 90. Meanwhile, the lower river was left to flow, deeper and faster, as the Missouri and Ohio poured in. But even there the channel was trained, levees raised, banks hardened, and dredges institutionalized. The deal struck was political as much as hydraulic. Cheap commerce today in exchange for a maintenance bill tomorrow. Tomorrow kept arriving. Appropriations came in bursts, overhauls were deferred, custom parts replaced catalogs. The Corps of Engineers kept the mission, keep the promise, while the budget turned the mission into triage. Here's where the straitjacket shows up. A 600-foot lock forces a 1,200-foot tow to break apart, lock twice, and reassemble. Every split adds minutes that become hours in a queue that becomes days in a drought. The infrastructure that tames the river also dictates the bottleneck. The hardware ages into guesswork. A cracked miter gate isn't a repair, it's a regional event. Legal regimes reinforced the shape. Mandates prioritized navigation, 9 feet, available, while flood control, habitat, recreation, and water supply stitched around it. Permits layered on top of levees. Habitat projects became offsets for channel training. The governance map froze the physical map. When climate variability tightened, there was nowhere for the system to flex without untying laws and budgets written for a steadier river. What nobody knew at the time, outside the rooms writing those laws, was how incentives would drift. The Inland Waterways Trust Fund asked barge operators to help fund new construction, not maintenance, so rehabilitation fell to annual fights in Congress. Short-term dollars chased long-term declines in steel. The argument became familiar. Industry pushed for modernization, 200-foot chambers that matched today's tows. Conservation groups said stop building new, fix what's broken, and stop deepening the trap. Local communities wanted benefits without spoil sites. Governors wanted navigation without the ecological trade-offs. The result wasn't a decision, it was drift. Meanwhile, the dredging treadmill sped up. Channelization pinched the river, pushing more energy into fewer bends, chewing banks, and feeding sediment to the next choke point. Plans devised in the 1980s for where to put sand reached their expiration, just as drought flood whiplash began dumping sand in all the wrong places. Every load removed is a debt coming due downstream. The old agreements didn't anticipate this volume or this variance. New agreements take years that low water doesn't offer. There's an irony baked into the steel. The system built to guarantee cheap movement hardened the corridor against adaptation. A promise that once widened opportunity now narrows options. When the river falls, the 9-foot guarantee becomes a courtroom sentence for a physical system that can't comply. When the river rises too fast, levees hold until they don't, and the cost of keeping the channel clear fights with the cost of keeping towns dry. So the straitjacket isn't just structure, it's expectation. Generations built planting calendars, export contracts, and municipal budgets on the assumption that the river would behave because we made it behave. Now the river is answering to a new climate, and the iron is answering to time. Everything that follows, the queues, the draft caps, the salt wedge meetings, was baked in when we traded a living river for a regulated one and forgot to update the terms. When the water vanishes, drought, sediment, and draft limits. 3 years earlier, the gauge at Memphis fell below zero stage and stayed there. In October 2023, it reached a record -12 feet. Heat stacked over the basin, rain slid north or never formed, and what did fall soaked back into dry ground and corn leaves before it reached the channel. Evapotranspiration took its cut, tributaries trickled, and the river thinned until a 9-foot promise looked like a rumor. You could stand on a bluff and see sand where tow pilots expected water. Stakes first, every foot that disappears squeezes a system built on pennies per ton. The corridor runs on thin margins and long assumptions. When the surface drops, the bottom rises in all the worst places. Sand moves like a living thing, rolling, settling, weaving bars across bends that yesterday were clean. For Jake, inches vanished from beneath his hull. For Elise, those inches turned into basis points shaved off her bid. Action looked like triage by the inch. The Coast Guard notices hit inboxes, drafts capped to 10.5 feet southbound near Memphis and 10 feet northbound, tow widths narrowed, tow lengths cut. A 15-barge tow became 12, then 9. Cargo was shaved, soybeans, corn, fertilizer, until the tow looked skeletal. Conv orders arrived for problem reaches. One at a time through narrow windows with escort boats, daylight preferred. Pilots called each other with fresh soundings because yesterday's depth was today's. Dredgers chased the sediment pulse with GPS plots that changed every shift. The dredge goats and her kin vacuumed channels, moving mountains of sand, and still a wind push could undo a day's work. Meanwhile, unknown to dispatchers upriver, Gulf water began creeping inland. With flows low and momentum gone, a salt wedge nosed up the bottom like a spy moving under the surface. City engineers mapped intake elevations and drafted plans for freshwater barges while grain tows idled 100 miles north. In recent low-flow years, the wedge advanced more than 60 river miles, forcing emergency barriers and intake protections. Navigation and drinking water were no longer separate categories. They shared a crisis table. Who moves first when the river can't do both? Impact arrived in prices and time. The USDA's barge movement numbers slid week by week. Southbound grain tonnage fell by roughly 79% in just over a month. Freight quotes climbed, around $18 per ton toward the mid-$20s on tight stretches, while elevators posted weaker bids to cover the lift. Basis widened along the river like a bruise. Elise watched a 10-cent spread turn to 50, then flirt with $1. Storage filled. Elevators throttled intake. Trucks circled or parked, and demurrage, money paid for waiting, became the cost of doing business. What nobody knew at the time outside a handful of hydrologists was how the sediment would reorganize the battlefield. A wet spring had sprinted through, carrying sand in suspension, then the faucet shut off. When velocity sagged, the load dropped, just where the channel kinked or the cross-current tugged. New bars appeared upstream of old ones. A day later, a bar vanished and reformed downstream, a prankster reshaping the board. Dredge plans written in the morning were obsolete by dinner. Here's the complication. The system can't slow demand when the river slows supply. Harvest doesn't wait. Refiners don't pause output. Fertilizer booked for fall application can't appear in January and still matter. So everyone tried to move the same volume through a smaller pipe. More trips with lighter loads meant more towboats pushing more hours, burning more fuel per ton. Safety margins narrowed. Grounding risk rose. Photos of stuck tows made headlines, but the real story was the silent math of delay. On a Tuesday, Jake took a convoy slot through a notorious crossing. He'd shaved draft to the cap, cut tow width, and still felt gravel kiss steel. Deckhands listened for the wrong vibration and stared at the bank where dredge pipes lay coiled like fire hoses before a blaze. He cleared, but hours evaporated. Downriver, a queue formed at a lock working flawlessly, but overwhelmed by throttled flow and shrunken tow sizes. Each lockage took longer because every tow had to split and repin. The machinery wasn't failing, the water was. Across town, Elise called her agronomist. The fertilizer barge wasn't coming this week, maybe next. Missed the window and yield pays next year. She ran numbers on hauling to a distant rail loader, but rails had their own congestion and crews were thin. She could store, but bins were full and fans had run hard through a warm stretch. She sold a tranche at a punishing basis to meet a note, and it felt like handing money to the river. In the aftermath, something subtle shifted. Traders began to price reliability, not just price. Buyers in Brazil watched the queue at the Gulf and stepped in. Contracts nudged loadings to the Pacific Northwest where capacity existed but costs rose. Insurers tweaked policies, deductibles up for low water seasons, exclusions clarified. Shippers quietly rewrote playbooks. Lighter drafts as standard in fall, more early season pushes, more hedges against corridor delays. It all cost more. The cheap food model took another cut. But here's the thing, low water is only half the trap. The other half is the machinery built to tame the river becoming the bottleneck when the river pulses thin. The locks that held the 9-foot promise were about to show how a single hinge could hold a continent in place. The machinery that can't stop, aging locks and single-point failures. While low water thinned the pipe, the iron that's supposed to smooth the ride started showing its age in the worst possible way. Think about a 200-foot toe sliding toward a 600-foot chamber. It doesn't fit. You nose in half, pin barges to a fleeting wall, lock through, back out, rebuild the toe, then do it again. On a good day, that's hours. On a tight river, it's the difference between a market made and a contract missed. Stakes first, every extra lockage on shrunken toes multiplies delay across the corridor. Perishables lose value by the hour. Fuel and chemicals get caught mid-route. Crews are paid to wait. And here's the twist. Most of the 29 critical locks on the upper Mississippi were built in the 1930s and are pushing 90 years, working past their intended lifespan. Parts aren't on shelves. They're fabricated in one-off batches by machinists who know the smell of old steel. A hinge the size of a car door becomes a national asset when the line stretches upriver. Action showed up as a hairline crack deep in a miter gate at a mid-river lock, a flaw found on a routine inspection that could turn catastrophic if ignored. Operators slowed the cadence to nurse it along while a replacement leaf was rushed from a shop states away. Upstream, Jake joined a queue that bent around a mile marker he'd never waited at before. The radio filled with call signs, drafts, and quiet calculations. Dispatchers juggled lock windows like air traffic controllers, with half their runways closed. Meanwhile, unknown to them, the shop foreman machining that new leaf had pulled retirees back in for their hands, not just their heads. The old prints were thin, tolerances unforgiving. They milled through a weekend, heat treating at midnight, praying the holes matched the pins in a structure poured when swing music was new. A crane contract was lined up. A marine crew rehearsed the swap on paper because the river wouldn't give them a second take. Impact rippled fast. A single cracked gate slowed hundreds of barges in a day. Elevators upriver throttled intake to avoid piling grain against a stop sign they couldn't see. Downriver, export terminals trimmed load schedules, lineups thinned at the Gulf. Freight quotes ticked up again. Elise refreshed barge ETA notes and watched them slide to TBD. A trucker slept another night in his cab outside her elevator, waiting to dump. Insurance adjusters flagged the closure as a named event in their files. Traders marked basis wider on the reach above the trouble spot. The river wasn't closed, but it might as well have been for anyone in the wrong sequence. What nobody knew at the time outside the lock's control room was how close the operators were running the system to keep water levels stable between pools. Those dams don't just hold for navigation, they regulate the staircase. When one chamber's cadence slows, levels can drift. Too much and you risk a grounding inside the lock. Too little and you risk a scrape on the sill. They were choreographing inches with iron built before jet engines. This was the moment everything changed for the crew on site. The replacement leaf arrived at dusk on a barge. Floodlights washed the chamber in hard white. Pin pullers hammered at frozen steel, the sound ringing off concrete poured in the depression. The new gate swung into place under a crane hook that creaked like an old tendon. Bolts torqued. Hydraulics sighed. The first test close felt like the last breath before a verdict. It held. In the aftermath, queues shortened by degrees, not leaps. Jake made his slot through before dawn, rebuilt his toe with cold fingers, and pushed into the pool like a runner who'd been kept on the blocks too long. He lost a day but kept his season intact. Elise dumped 3 trucks at a less awful basis than last week, knowing it could have been worse. The crack became a story told in bars and boardrooms, how one hinge put a price on time. But here's the problem the swap didn't solve. There are dozens of gates, gears, pintles, and coin blocks just like that one. Maintenance windows get deferred because traffic never stops and budgets never match needs. Every deferred rehab becomes a bet that the next floor will show up in inspection, not under load. Every bet pushes the system deeper into a mode where a small failure becomes a regional event. While that was happening in St. Louis, engineers in Winfield pointed to the one bright spot, Lock 25, finally getting a 1,200-foot chamber. It'll help someday, but a single new box on a staircase of old ones doesn't erase the physics. Until the chain is strong end-to-end, the weakest link sets the pace. And on a river that can't slow demand, pace is everything. Quiet Triage, Rationing a national artery. While Jake rebuilt his toe in the dark, dispatchers ran a playbook nobody advertised. Draft caps, convoy orders, tow length limits. On paper, they're safety. In practice, they're rationing. The queue manager's spreadsheet becomes a triage board for a national artery. Bulk food, fuel, fertilizer, chemicals, each line a claim on water that isn't there. Stakes first, every hour assigned or withheld decides whose margins survive. A city downstream needs freshwater barge slots if the salt wedge climbs. A refinery needs feedstock. Grain needs to move before quality slips. Ecology needs minimum flows for fish and wetlands that buffer floods. Each priority is righteous. They don't fit in the same day. Action looks like choreography by constraint. The Coast Guard posts an updated restriction. The Corps carves a pass, then posts a window. Daylight only through a trouble reach, no passing escorts required. Towboats cluster at the mouth like planes stacked over an airport. Dispatches sort by cargo class, contract obligations, and who's already eaten delay. Insurance clauses creep into the room, force majeure thresholds, low water riders. The people at the table won't call it rationing. The river does. Meanwhile, in a state house 200 miles away, a governor's office calls an emergency meeting. Navigation needs line up against drinking water and habitat flows. Agencies are careful, legalistic. Staff lawyers keep score in the margins. A fisheries biologist warns that another inch off the target pool will strand backwaters. A water director warns that another inch the other way pushes brackish water into intakes. The call ends with a compromise nobody loves. Unknown to them, the queue at a midriver lock just doubled. Commodity desks move faster. Traders slide loadings from the Gulf to the Pacific Northwest, where rail can just barely absorb a shift at a premium. Basis along the mid-Mississippi widens for small elevators first. Big houses blend rail with barge and call it optionality. A family-run house on a side channel has no option. They post a bid that hurts. Farmers read the number and feel the rationing in their pocket. Impact shows up in prices and power. Freight quotes spike and then stick. The smallest producers absorb the volatility because they can't hedge what they can't deliver. Elevators impose tighter delivery windows. Contracts sprout new language, subject to river conditions, subject to draft limits. Risk migrates down the chain. The river is a market that clears with time instead of cash. Get this, priority isn't just cargo, it's relationships. A tow with a history of safe passage and crews known by name gets the nudge when convoy slots are scarce. A new operator waits. An ethanol plant with a political footprint gets a call returned. A feed mill on a quiet bend doesn't. Nobody says it out loud. Everyone knows it's true. What nobody knew at the time, Jake says later over coffee, was who decided the line. He's not wrong. The decisions are spread across conference calls and pilot houses, tug radios and core emails, port captains and lockmasters who hear desperation in every request. A cracked gate far upstream triggers a cascade. Convoy near Memphis, split tows near Alton, escort rule on a bend that silts overnight. The map becomes a living ration card. Meanwhile, cities watch the salt line like a creeping shadow. One parish drafts a plan to barge freshwater upriver to blend at an intake. That proposal consumes convoy slots that grain expected to use. A week later, rain inches the line back, and those slots go to fertilizer headed upriver for a tight fall window. Each pivot leaves someone holding the bag. Insurance is the quiet enforcer. Policies kick in when delays pass named thresholds. Some cargo gets protected, others don't. A small operator learns that low water isn't covered the way high water is. Deductibles rise next season. Premiums move faster than dredges. Credit lines tighten for barge lines with thin balance sheets. They sell a vessel or two. Capacity vanishes in the exact moment it's needed most. This was the moment everything changed, a mayor on the lower river says after the wedge briefing. We asked for barge slots for water, and the phones lit up from upriver. He pauses. We didn't choose between crops and taps. The river chose for us. Grain waited, water moved. The queue reset with a new hierarchy. In the aftermath, the corridor internalized rationing as normal. Dispatchers built models that priced minutes. Surge teams stood up to push through choke points. Dynamic guidance systems rolled out to forecast depths by day, then by hour. None of it created water. All of it assigned scarcity with better spreadsheets. The moral burden didn't go away, it just got faster. Here's the quiet truth that sticks with Jake and Elise. Nobody posts the rationing schedule on a website. You feel it in a withheld slot, a widened basis, an email stamped "restrictions remain in effect." You see it in a dredge swinging its arm at dawn and in a lockmaster's tone when he says, "Not today." The river doesn't collapse, it's allocated. And allocation, in a low-trust system, feels like punishment. Everything was about to change again when the dollar math surfaced. How inches turn into billions long before any headline says collapse. The economics of a stall, from barge to grocery bill. While the queue thickened, the first numbers that moved weren't headlines. They were freight quotes. A broker in St. Louis looked at his screen and saw the river's quiet tax climb, cents turning into dollars per ton as drafts shrank and tow sizes fell. That bump didn't stay in his inbox. It crawled into every bid downstream and every bill upstream. Stakes first. When barge costs rise, the cheapest transport in America stops being cheap. Export margins thin until foreign buyers blink. The Mississippi's price edge is measured in a few dollars a ton. Take those away, and Brazil wins the next sale before your corn leaves the belt. The river doesn't just carry grain, it carries competitiveness. Action looked like arithmetic under pressure. Freight rates that hover in the teens in good years nudged toward the mid-20s on tight reaches. Elevators recalculated basis to cover the lift, shaving cash bids to keep from losing money on every ton shipped. Elise watched her local bid sink a dime, then another, as the broker's quote ticked higher each morning. The export desk in New Orleans saw vessel lineups thin and spread sheets of offers from the Black Sea across the table. Buyers who normally split cargoes between origins quietly shifted the bigger slice away from the Gulf. Unknown to them, a flour mill buyer in North Africa redlined a U.S. tender on reliability, not price. "We can't risk a Laken stretch," he told his procurement team. It wasn't the cheapest ton that won, it was the ton that showed up on time. Reliability got a premium. The Mississippi lost it, inch by inch. Impact rippled through storage and credit. Elevators along the river hit max capacity faster because barges arrived lighter and less often. They imposed intake limits to avoid drowning in grain they couldn't push south. Farmers like Elise made hard choices: sell into a punishing basis and take the cash flow hit, or stuff more into on-farm bins and pray the fans held quality through a warm spell. Banks noticed. Operating lines tightened if inventory turned slower. Notes didn't move when the river did. Meanwhile, refined products felt the drag. Diesel and chemicals that ride upriver arrived late and thin. A co-op manager in Iowa juggled allocations to keep harvest moving while his supplier texted barge delayed like a daily ritual. Fertilizer prices twitched on timing risk. Miss a week in fall and you pay in spring with yield. The energy pass-through climbed the ladder, terminal fees, trucking surcharges, retail prices nudged up. You didn't see the river in the pump price, but it was there. Here's where it gets concrete at the checkout aisle. Feed costs rise when corn doesn't flow smoothly, even if futures don't spike. That creeps into poultry integrators' ledgers, then into wholesale lists, then into the sticker on a tray of chicken breasts months later. A container of packaged foods has a transport line item that grows when inputs hiccup. The river's hiccup becomes a grocery bill cough. "Get this," Jake said over coffee to a cousin who farms. "An inch of draft can cost millions a day across the corridor." He wasn't guessing. An inch means fewer tons per barge multiplied by thousands of barges. The math doesn't care about anecdotes. It moves quietly into cost curves, then into prices. Meanwhile, a port scheduler in the Gulf stared at idle berth time and called Rail to backfill. Rail said yes, at a premium, and then warned that crews were tight and yards congested. The reroute worked on paper. On the ground, cars stacked outside a choke point 2 states away. The plan shifted delays, didn't erase them. Each substitution added dollars per ton, and those dollars had only 2 places to go: back to farmers or forward to consumers. Often both. What nobody knew at the time outside a circle of actuaries was how insurance would translate delay into new baseline costs. Policies reset on experience. After back-to-back low water seasons, deductibles rose and exclusions sharpened. Shippers priced that into their bids. Exporters padded schedules or paid for priority. The corridors, just in time, became just in case, and just in case is expensive. Multiplier effects stacked. Port labor saw hours swing. Towboats burned more fuel per ton to make up for lighter loads. Truckers bounced between jammed elevators and distant rail loaders, clocking empty miles. A maintenance crew sat idle waiting for a barge that would arrive next week instead of today, then scrambled at 2 a.m. when 3 showed at once. Idle capital, idle crews, overtime, none of it shows up on a weather map. All of it lands on an invoice. Then came the customer phone calls. A Latin American buyer asked for assurance on a December Laken. The answer hedged. He split the order, half Gulf, half Brazil. That decision doesn't reverse fast. Reliability habits stick. Contracts shift for a season, then a year. The corridor loses not by collapse, but by erosion. In the aftermath, Elise bought more bin fans and a bigger generator, hedging against the next stall with capital she could have used elsewhere. Jake's company added a second dispatcher to play traffic cop across trouble reaches. An exporter funded extra dredge hours near a terminal to keep a private berth clear. Microfixes stacked like sandbags against a rising cost tide. But here's the part that circles back to your cart. All those sandbags raise the floor. Even when rain returns and gauges climb, some costs don't come down. Contracts have memories. Premiums linger. Buyers keep options open. The Mississippi still moves the cheapest calories on Earth until inches disappear and the cheap turns conditional. That condition ends up as a line on a grocery bill that nobody traces back to a barge scraping a shoal at mile 595. The fix that politics won't touch: costs, permits, and time. While the economics bled into grocery bills, a quieter calculation sat on a shelf: the fix. On paper it's simple: deeper channels, new 1-200-foot lock chambers, rebuilt gates, modern controls, more resilient river geometry. In reality, it's a price tag with a decade strapped to it. Stakes first: every season we delay, costs rise and risk compounds. The corridor's advantage erodes not by collapse, but by paperwork and inflation. A lock upgrade you could fund at a few billion across sites 10 years ago grows with steel prices, labor tightness, and interest. Meanwhile, shippers price unreliability, buyers rewire contracts. The longer you wait, the less the fix buys you. Action begins where blueprints meet law. A new chamber means environmental review, hundreds of pages on fish passage, wetlands offsets, cultural resources, and how spoil will be placed without smothering what's left of backwater habitat. Agencies must sequence dredging windows around spawning seasons. A deeper cut in one reach triggers mitigation elsewhere. Plant willows, build islands, reconnect a slough. It's doable. It's not fast. Permits layer like sediment. Federal statutes, state water quality certifications, endangered species consultations, and local land use fights over spoil sites. A port town wants the jobs but balks at a sand mountain. A county board says yes, then reverses when trucks rumble past a school. The Corps rewrites a placement plan, costs shift. The clock keeps time in meetings, not miles. Meanwhile, the checkbook isn't one checkbook. The Inland Waterways diesel tax feeds a trust fund that covers a minority share of new construction, not maintenance. Maintenance, where failures hide, relies on annual appropriations, which arrive in fits between continuing resolutions and budget brinksmanship. A lock rehab can't run on start-stop money. Fabricators won't hold quotes for a year while committees argue. Crews scatter when projects stall. Momentum dies in the gap between an authorization and an appropriation. Unknown to them, across town, a coalition of shippers hires economists to model returns on upfront private contributions. Pay now, get priority passage later, recoup via saved delays. The math pencils in a spreadsheet. The politics don't. Tolling is barred. Priority sounds like privatized access to a public river. The idea gets polite nods and a long cooling off. Here's where it gets interesting. Every mandate shares the same channel. Flood control, navigation, habitat, recreation, drinking water. There's no spare capacity to borrow from. Deepening a bend to buy inches for barges can intensify bank erosion downstream unless matched with habitat work. Raising levees protects a town and pushes flood stages on a neighbor. Reconnecting a floodplain to stabilize flows means giving water somewhere to go, and that somewhere is someone's pasture. The right fix is a package. Packages don't fit slogans. NIMBY meets nature. A widened reach requires new spoil sites. A community that loves the river's view doesn't love a sand train. Conservation groups sue over shortcuts. Industry warns that delay risks a forced closure next harvest. Judges become traffic controllers. Settlements prescribe habitat islands and bank stabilization that add cost and time. Everyone claims victory, the river gets a compromise. Impact lands in the calendar. Even when funded, a large lock addition or rehab is a 7 to 10 year arc. Design, review, bid, fabricate, stage, execute within narrow navigation windows. You can't shut the artery for a year. You slice, work, reopen, repeat, praying the old half holds while you build the new. Any surprise, steel floor, flood, drought, shifts milestones by seasons. Meanwhile, inflation eats budgets. A multi-year estimate written in calm markets doesn't survive a spike in diesel or a labor squeeze. Contractors add contingencies. Lawmakers balk at revised totals. A project phases down to match the money and loses the economy of scale it needed. The vicious loop gets tighter, smaller steps, longer timelines, higher risk. But wait, there's more. Each season of low water adds emergency dredging bills that don't count toward modernization but drain the same pot. You spend millions keeping a shoal passable that you'll rebuild in 5 years. There's no award for saving a crisis that didn't make the news. There's a line item and a crew that slept on deck. The only way through is bundles. A slate of modular mitre gates ordered at once to standard specs. Rehab clusters that let crews roll site to site without losing time. Design-build contracts that collapse phases and eat some risk. Early coordination with refuge managers to bank mitigation before a dredge pumps the first grain. It still takes years, but years with a spine. What nobody wants to say out loud is that modernization won't restore yesterday's reliability. It raises the floor, buys inches, widens chambers, and gives operators breathing room in a tighter climate. It doesn't make droughts kinder or buyers forget. The fix is necessary and insufficient. Politics hate that sentence. In the aftermath of another thin fall, a bill drafts language for a handful of new chambers and accelerated rehabs. Advocates call it historic. Critics call it late. Jake shrugs. Elise nods and asks her lender about a bin extension. They've learned the fix is coming and the river will still ration next year. So industry tries end runs, private dredge dollars near terminals, voluntary depth targets with dynamic pricing for peak slots, data sharing to smooth convoys. All useful, all partial. The big cut, time, money, permits, still sits upstream. Every year we delay, the cost of the same inch rises, and the river keeps sending invoices in sand. Workarounds and their limits, pivots that don't pencil. While the big fix sat in hearings, everyone tried to route around the river. On paper, rail would flex, trucks would surge, pipelines would cover liquids, and coastal shipping would shoulder more load. On the ground, each workaround met a ceiling fast. Stakes first. If the Mississippi can't carry bulk cheaply, the country has to pay more to move the same ton. That cost doesn't disappear, it relocates to rail yards already full, highways already strained, crews already short. Every pivot drains the cushion that keeps food, fuel, and fertilizer affordable. Action looked like phones lighting up at Class I railroads. Exporters asked for unit train slots to the Pacific Northwest. The answer came with a caveat, yes at a premium, and yes with dwell times creeping because crews were tight and yards congested. A 100-car grain train can substitute for a slice of a toe, but not for a corridor. Elise priced the shift and saw the spread eat her bid. Rail made sense for a few, not for all. Trucking surged where rail couldn't go. Rates jumped, then jumped again as seasonal drivers hit hours of service limits. 1,000 trucks to replace one standard tow sounded heroic in a press release and impossible at a way station. Bridges on rural routes weren't rated for constant heavy cycles. Elevators posted truck appointment windows and filled them within hours. A line of hoppers idled on a 2-lane blacktop while dispatchers hunted empty miles to backhaul. Diesel burned, margins thinned. Meanwhile, liquids tried to pivot to pipelines, but pipelines don't appear in a drought. They're fixed, regulated, and already booked. New corridors take years of permits and fights. Refined products moved by barge, trickled by truck and rail where possible, compounding congestion. Coastal shipping could help, but the Jones Act narrowed the fleet and raised the price. Charter a compliant vessel, sure, if you can find one that isn't booked 2 months out. Unknown to them, a PNW terminal manager walked catwalks counting empty bays. Capacity existed, but not endless. Elevators shifted contracts west, and the queue formed there instead. Trains stacked across a mountain subdivision, power in short supply during a cold snap. A delay traded zip codes. The invoice remained. Export rerouting met its own drought. The Panama Canal's low water tightened transits, capping daily slots and prioritizing higher-paying ships. Grain isn't a premium cargo. Vessels destined from the Gulf to Asia waited or detoured. Charters grew more expensive. A route meant to outrun Mississippi risk ran into its own climate bottleneck. Insurance writers nodded. Correlation, not coincidence. On-farm storage expanded as a pressure valve. Elise called a builder for a new bin quote. Prices had climbed, so had the wait list. She weighed capital against uncertainty, more steel against the hope that the river rises next fall. Storage buys time but invites risk. Warm autumns stress aeration. A fan failure turns grain into compost. Credit lines stretch to cover metal that doesn't move bushels by itself. Here's the crazy part. Each workaround raised emissions and costs, the opposite of the river's edge. Barges move a ton with less fuel than trucks or rail. Shifting to higher carbon modes to bridge a climate-driven low water is a loop that tightens both cost and climate. A co-op tallied fuel per ton moved pre- and post-pivot. The number hurt to read. Micro-stories made it real. A short-line railroad took overflow from a river terminal, then stalled when a Class I denied priority at the interchange. Cars sat in a cornfield for 5 days. A trucking firm pulled drivers from livestock runs to haul grain, then lost a contract when a feedlot missed deliveries. A coastal shipper slotted a Jones Act vessel, then watched a storm pin it in port for a week. Every plan B had a plan C taped to it. What nobody knew at the time outside a few logistics desks was how substitution caps cascade. Rail has cars, but not infinite crews. Trucks have drivers, but not enough loading slots or legal hours. Pipelines have capacity, but not the right molecules at the right time. Coastal routes need vessels and stable canals. Push one mode, and the weakness migrates. The river's scarcity became a structure of scarcity. Behavior shifted. Buyers diversified origins by contract, not by preference. A mill took a little from Brazil to hedge a lock closure. An ethanol plant locked more rail for winter and ate the premium. A fertilizer importer booked earlier in the year and paid storage to dodge a fall barge risk. Each decision made sense alone. Together, they edged U.S. Gulf flows off-center. Meanwhile, emissions accounting crept into decisions. A brand promised lower carbon supply chains, but quietly accepted higher carbon logistics to keep shelves full. The marketing copy stayed green. The ledger went red. Nobody bragged about swapping barges for trucks. In the aftermath, the workarounds calcified into policy memos, surge agreements between railroads and ports, standing truck appointment systems at elevators, prearranged coastal charters for drought scenarios. They help. They don't pencil at scale without raising costs that land on someone's table. And here's the pivot that doesn't pivot. Every plan B depends on time the river won't give. Deals, drivers, crews, cars, and ships aren't conjured by a falling gauge. You can't backfill a river with spreadsheets. You can only pay more to move less. Global ripples, food security, and rival suppliers. While Elise sold into a bruised basis and Jake chased convoy slots, procurement desks an ocean away were redrawing maps. A buyer in Shanghai opened 2 spreadsheets, Gulf offers with uncertain lakens, and Brazil's slate with steadier timelines. He didn't need the cheapest ton, he needed the surest arrival. He split the book, quietly shifting long-term volume to the origin that could deliver in a drought year. Stakes first. The Mississippi isn't just a U.S. corridor, it's a price signal for half the planet's calories. When reliability slips, food importing nations hedge. Humanitarian pipelines stretch. Margins at home become meals abroad. The river's inches turn into ration cards in cities that will never see it. Action looked like rivals stepping into a vacuum. Brazil's Cerrado kept adding soy acres and export capacity. New northern ports on the Amazon corridor trimmed days to China. Argentina, even through policy whiplash, turned up the crush, selling oil and meal with fewer river choke points than whole bean flows. Black Sea exporters, when geopolitics allowed, moved wheat aggressively with freight differentials that narrowed Gulf's edge. A low Mississippi amplified their pitch: we can load on time. Meanwhile, a Middle Eastern grain agency revised tender language. Reliability premiums crept in, penalties for late arrival, bonuses for early lacons. The calculus favored origins with redundancy. The Gulf's advantage, cheap barge-fed volume, was conditional again. When those conditions failed, long-term contracts drifted. Once drifted, they didn't snap back fast. Meanwhile, in West Africa, a miller tracking vessel movements cut his reliance on a single origin. He diversified not because of price, but because a barge stuck at mile 595 had cost him a month's throughput last season. He signed a rolling purchase with a Brazilian house that promised shipment windows with teeth. That clause was a bet against the Mississippi's hydrology. Impact hit quietly at home. U.S. soybean crush kept humming, but export stems thinned at the Gulf and thickened in the Pacific Northwest, then met their own bottlenecks. Corn sales to traditional buyers slipped a few percentage points, then a few more. It didn't crash, it eroded. A decade from now, those points add up to plants built elsewhere, rail spurs laid in other countries, and a talent pipeline that flows away from U.S. ports. Humanitarian corridors felt the pinch. The World Food Programme priced tenders higher as Laken risk rose. A delayed cargo of fortified flour pushed a distribution back a week in the Horn of Africa. In a field office, a logistics officer stared at a whiteboard of shipments and erased a line with a sigh. Donations didn't fall, delivery got harder. Reliability is a form of aid. The river tested it. Soybean meal told another story. As crushers in the US, Brazil, and Argentina scaled, feed chains synced to the most predictable vessel stacks. Livestock integrators in Southeast Asia shifted rations to match what arrived, not what was cheapest on paper. A single missed vessel meant reformulating feed on the fly. That cost didn't show up on commodity charts. It lived in barns and spreadsheets. What nobody knew at the time, outside a handful of shipping desks, was how freight differentials would lock in new habits. Chartering a Panamax to load at a northern Brazilian port during U.S. low water penciled better once, then again, then became the default. Traders aren't sentimental. They follow spread and schedule. The Mississippi's seasonal unpredictability trained them to look elsewhere first, then backfill with Gulf slots when water and locks cooperated. The U.S. didn't lose volume overnight. It ceded primacy in the queue. OPEC-like dynamics emerged in grain, not a cartel, but a club of reliable sellers able to nudge flows by signaling certainty. Reliability trumped volume. When two origins could meet price, the one with fewer choke points won a premium. The US still had scale, storage, and a deep market, but scale without predictability is a balance sheet, not a moat. Meanwhile, fertilizer moved the other direction. Importers who fed the Corn Belt watched river timing too. A phosphate cargo that missed fall application windows cascaded into lower yields next year, cutting exportable surplus the year after. The loop closed globally. River inches in October reshaped a buyer's bid in March and a humanitarian delivery in June. Micro-stories made it real. A Philippine feed mill swapped a 3-year US meal contract for a blended origin deal after 2 late arrivals. An Egyptian wheat tender split evenly between the Black Sea and Brazil after Gulf loading slipped, even though the US paper price looked attractive. A Vietnamese soy buyer paid more per ton to avoid a Laken risk that once felt hypothetical. In the aftermath, US exporters leaned into optionality, more PNW bookings, earlier season Gulf stems, deeper coordination with rail. It helped, but reliability premiums lived in the market now. Buyers priced them, insurers embedded them, and rivals planned around them. The Mississippi still set a tone. It no longer set the tempo. Under the surface, the ecology that sustains the river economy was cracking too. The highway depends on a living system that's getting less able to carry the load. And when the river's biology buckles, logistics get even harder. The ecological feedback, a river less able to be a highway. While buyers rewrote contracts, the river rewrote itself. Channelization pinched bends, levees tightened banks, and every dredge cut that carved a straight shot sped the treadmill that keeps the channel open. When water runs hard in a narrowed path, it eats the banks. That erosion feeds sediment downstream. The more we train the river to behave, the more sand it delivers to choke points that don't care about schedules. Stakes first, the highway depends on a living system that handled variance by spreading water across floodplains and backwaters. Those were storage tanks and sediment traps built by nature. We severed them to keep barges moving close to shore and towns dry behind levees. It worked until storms got sharper and droughts bit deeper. With fewer places to put water, floods crest higher. With fewer places to hold water, droughts drop levels faster. Logistics rides that seesaw. Action is visible in the shallows. Backwaters fill in because sediment that once spread across a broad plain now concentrates in a fast, narrow chute. Fish that needed deep refuge find muck. Mussel beds that filtered water vanish under inches of silt. The Corps, under a mandate to maintain navigation, dredges the Talweg and sprays sand where flows can carry it. Upstream, where the river is tight, they stack it on islands or truck it inland, colliding with refuge managers, city councils, and neighbors who see a dune rising behind their homes. Old placement plans from the 198s have reached their limits. New ones take years. Meanwhile, wetlands loss removes a pressure valve. Those marshes absorbed flood peaks and bled water back slowly. Replace them with fields and roofs, and runoff hits the channel like a hammer. A wet spring rushes sediment and wood through locks designed for a different pulse. A hot summer pulls moisture back into the air before it reaches the river. The channel sees less steady flow, more whiplash. Operators manage inches between pools, while the system beneath them trends toward extremes. Impact lands in maintenance and biology at once. More sediment means more dredging dollars, and more dredging means more fights over where to put the spoils. A near closure at Cassville becomes a template. Scramble for a site, argue over mussels, plant willows to hold a sandbank that shouldn't exist. Navigation keeps moving, but the cost per inch rises. Habitat projects offset some damage, engineered islands, reconnections where politics allow, but they're patches on a quilt that's unraveling under heat and variance. Then there's the salt. In the lower river, sea level rise and low flows team up. Without enough fresh water pushing seaward, dense Gulf water noses inland along the bottom, a salt wedge that doesn't care about barge schedules or municipal budgets. City engineers plan intake protections, floating pipelines, even barge-delivered fresh water. Those moves compete with navigation for convoy slots during crises. A hotter climate makes these intrusions more likely. Every inch of sea rise, every notch of drought risk, shifts the line where fresh meets brackish. The highway needs fresh. The delta is negotiating with salt. Invasive species add friction you won't see on a rate sheet. Warmer water invites carp and other opportunists that disrupt food webs and stir sediment with every thrash. Algal blooms ride nutrient loads flushed in pulses from tiled fields and paved streets. Blooms steal oxygen in backwaters that once grew fish and now suffocate them. A river that's biologically stressed is a river that's harder to manage. You can keep a channel open through a sick system, but it fights every inch you win. What this meant became clear on a tow deck at dawn. Jake's crew watched a dredge clear a crossing they'd scraped yesterday. The cut held for a day, then a wind shift pushed water sideways and dropped sand right back in. Dredge, pass, refill, repeat. The treadmill spun faster because the hydrology upstream, reshaped by levees and loss, fed the machine with perfect regularity at all the wrong moments. The more we fought the river into a line, the more the line broke. Micro-stories speak louder than diagrams. A refuge manager counts fewer diving ducks in a pool that used to winter them, the depth gone. A small town's well-field tests for chlorides too close to comfort, the wedge is climbing. A fisherman ties off below a lock and pulls a net with more algae than fish. None of them file freight quotes. All of them describe a system that resists being a highway. Here's where it gets interesting. Ecological fixes double as logistics fixes when they're allowed to. Reconnecting a floodplain in the right reach lowers flood peaks, slows water, traps sediment before it hits the channel, and buys inches of depth in drought. Island building in backwaters can re-establish circulation and cut resuspension. Wetland restoration upstream shaves the top off runoff, that shoves logs at lock gates. But those moves require taking land out of something else, paying people for changes, and waiting for biology to work on its clock. What nobody wants to say out loud in a budget hearing is that the cheapest inch of navigation depth may be stored in acres of wetland far from the lock chamber. The Corps can't order that alone. States can't fund it alone. Farmers won't absorb the hit alone. Without a pact, we'll keep spending millions to move sand from one bend to the next, while the river keeps making more. In the aftermath of another thin fall, the treadmill hums. Dredges run north of the Ohio confluence, roughly $45 million a year. Spoil sites fill. Habitat crews build islands that help a little. Tow pilots learn new gravel by feel. The highway still runs. It just runs on a living system that's less able every year to carry it. So the question shifts. If we can't make the river bigger, can we make our needs smaller? And can we rebuild enough of the river's memory that the highway stops fighting its host? Stopgaps and moonshots, buying inches, earning years. While the treadmill spun, a different kind of plan came together in conference rooms and pilot houses. Buy inches now, earn years later. Not grand fixes, interval training for a tired artery. Strategic dredging became triage with a calendar. District engineers prioritized shoals tied to seasonal bottlenecks, shifting crews like a chess clock. If a bar forms at a bend that blocks harvest grain, you hit it in September, not May. If fertilizer needs a window in late fall, you carve a pass on that reach before the first front locks in. It wasn't elegant, it was targeted pain relief. Upstream, reservoir managers compared notes they never shared this closely. Could a coordinated late-season release from a chain of dams add just enough push to raise a stubborn pool inches when it mattered? Not river-changing floods, surgical pulses timed to ease convoy rules at a treacherous crossing. Hydropower operators frowned at the trade-offs. Fish managers highlighted spawning windows. Everyone marked their non-negotiables. Still, a few test pulses nudged gauges a little higher when the corridor's need peaked. That little meant barge drafts regained an inch, and pilots breathed easier for a week. Meanwhile, the iron got modular. Old mitre gates don't wait politely for winter, so districts started bundling rehab, fabricate interchangeable gate leaves to stock like spare organs, then swap them in fast during tight closures instead of crafting one-off parts mid-crisis. A shop foreman loved the predictability, a lockmaster loved the hours saved. Crews rotated site to site under a single contract, keeping muscle memory hot. Each bundle shaved days off repairs that once sprawled into seasons. Operations borrowed a page from airlines, dynamic pricing for river time, peak drought, peak harvest, peak stress. Slots through a trouble reach carried a surcharge designed to smooth demand. It wasn't a toll, it was a signal. Those with flexibility shifted to shoulder hours or different days, earning cheaper passage and freeing scarce slots for food, fuel, and municipal water. Dispatchers grumbled. Then the queue stopped behaving like a panic line and started behaving like a schedule. Navigation surge teams formed like wildfire crews. When a shoal threatened to shut a pool or a lock's cadence faltered, the team dropped in, extra dredge hours, tow escorts, lock personnel, portable sensors. They weren't permanent, they were force multipliers that bought time. Predictive dispatch tools fed them targets, fresh sonar, current forecasts, tow drafts, so they could act before a problem hardened. A pilot called it seeing tomorrow's scrape today. Data became a currency. Terminal operators shared depth profiles and ETAs they once guarded. Barge lines fed anonymized drafts and speeds into models that forecast pinch points by hour. A co-op manager watching the dashboard could nudge deliveries to avoid a noon choke. Elise used the app to time her trucks into a shorter line, shaving a day off a week that had no days to spare. Then came the moonshots. Conversations long dismissed as fantasy shifted to whiteboards. A new generation of high-capacity locks, 1,200-foot chambers stacked along the staircase, bundled under a financing plan that moved them together instead of one at a time. Not just lock 25, 5 or 7 critical sites in a package that let contractors roll crews and steal from job to job. The price tag felt like swallowing a stone. The payoff was measured in decades of fewer split toes and fewer cascades from single-point failures. On the ecology side, selective reconnection with floodplains surfaced as the wild card that wasn't wild. Pick reaches where a setback levee or a controlled spillway could store a wet spring's punch and release it as a slow summer drip. Target backwaters that trap sediment before it hits the channel. Model it, pay for it, build it. The Corps can't order a county to move a levee. But a federal state package could pay a farmer for land that becomes a sponge, then reward the whole corridor with inches of drought resilience. The cheap inch might be miles from a locked gate. Micro-stories showed the shape of hope. A pilot steered through a bend newly cut by an emergency dredge 3 days earlier and didn't feel that telltale chatter underfoot. A lockmaster clicked a modular gate into service in 36 hours, not 10 days, and watched a queue shrink from a mile to a bend. A refuge manager pointed at a rebuilt island that calmed a backwater, and a dredge foreman said the nearby reach silted slower this season. Small wins banked like coins. But there was one problem. Every stopgap required trust and shared sacrifice in a system low on both. Dynamic pricing asked small shippers to believe they weren't being priced out. Reservoir coordination asked upriver towns to give water for downriver contracts. Floodplain projects asked rural counties to host water for cities they'd never see. Surge teams asked crews to live on call through harvest. Surgeons in hard hats paid in goodwill that had run thin. A meeting in a rivertown gym put it plainly. A farmer asked why his tax dollars should fund a lock 100 miles away. A mayor asked why his town should accept a spoil site. A barge operator asked why his line should pay more for a slot while rails and roads dodged similar fees. The answer wasn't comforting, because the alternative is rationing by accident, higher grocery bills, lost sales abroad, and a corridor that forgets how to be cheap. In the end, stopgaps buy inches and stabilize nerves. Moonshots, if they launch, buy years. Neither works without a pact that names who waits, who pays, and who moves first when the river shrinks. Someone will still be told to wait. The next fight is who gets picked. The politics of choice, winners, losers, and the story we tell. While engineers sketched fixes and dispatchers rationed time, the hardest work sat in public. Choice, who gets the river when the river can't be enough. The math was logistics, the fight was identity. Every inch allocated turned into a story about whose America mattered. Stakes first, priority frameworks aren't spreadsheets, they're values with decimals. Export crops keep dollars flowing and farm towns alive. Domestic water is non-negotiable. Habitat sustains the ecology that stabilizes flows. Refineries and chemical plants keep lights on and fields fed. There isn't a neutral stack. Elevate one and you're demoting another in a drought, a flood, or a week when a cracked hinge and a salt wedge share a headline. Action looked like hearings that played like culture war. In a Capitol committee room, an agriculture chair held up maps of elevators strung alongside channels like beads. If grain waits, Main Street closes, he said. A coastal lawmaker answered with a photograph of a brown glass tap sample. If water salts, whole parishes fail. A conservation witness described a levee setback that would shave flood peaks and trap sediment. A river county commissioner asked who would pay the farmer who lost a field to a floodplain. The gavel fell. Nobody left satisfied. Meanwhile, a memo circulated, an interim framework for low-flow emergencies. Tier 1, drinking water intakes and public safety tows. Tier 2, energy feedstocks and chemicals. Tier 3, bulk food and fertilizer. Tier 4, other cargo. It read clinical. On the ground, it decided whether Elise's corn moved before or after a polymer drum. Jake read the order and tightened his jaw. The list felt rational and unfair at the same time. Corporate scale shaped the quiet outcomes. A multinational with river, rail, and ocean freight under one roof cushioned losses with options. They swapped stems to the P&W, bargained for early slots, and bought dredge hours near their private docks. A family-owned elevator took the posted restrictions and the wider basis full in the chest. Insurance language softened blows for big balance sheets and sharpened them for small ones. Consolidation advanced by weather and steel fatigue as much as by strategy. Federalism didn't help. A governor upriver signed an emergency order to keep pools higher for navigation. Downriver, a parish leader demanded more fresh water to fight the wedge. Agencies traded letters. Courts became traffic controllers. A judge granted a narrow injunction that preserved inches in one reach and cost inches in another. The ruling didn't say grain versus taps. The hydrograph did. Here's where it gets interesting. transparency cut both ways. Open dashboards showing queue order and slot pricing calmed rumors on good days and sparked outrage on bad ones. A screenshot of a priority tow list hit a local Facebook group. Comments lit up. Why them? Who paid? The truth was boring and incendiary, a mix of cargo class, safety, history, and timing. The appearance of favoritism eroded trust faster than sand-built bars. Micro-stories showed the bruise. A mayor in a river town shook hands with a Corps colonel after a late-night dredge saved a harvest window, then took heat at the diner for agreeing to spoil sight. A tribal fisheries lead testified that a convoy window clipped a spawning run. The next day, she watched a grain tow idle, crew staring at water that wouldn't move. A refinery scheduler called a school superintendent to say diesel for buses would be tight next week. None of them controlled the gauge. All of them owned the backlash. Unknown to most, a backroom deal kept one lock's night shift staffed through a budget lull. The union agreed to stretch rotations. A chamber stayed open 16 hours instead of 12. Hundreds of barges slipped through a crisis on the back of a handshake and overtime. The press release never ran. The resentment did when another district couldn't match the favor. The story we tell about the river decided who people blamed. If it's a tale of feckless bureaucracy, every restriction looks like malice. If it's corporate greed, every priority slot is a scandal. If it's climate, the villain is distant and the fix feels impossible. The harder story to tell in 30 seconds is that the river is a shared constraint, and sharing hurts most at the edges. Impact hardened into policy muscles no one wanted to build. Governors named river czars. States drafted drought compacts with language about equitable allocation that lawyers could fight over later. Insurers rewrote corridor riders with clauses that mirrored the emergency tiers, baking rationing into premiums. Commodity groups published playbooks for their members: when to sell, when to store, how to lobby your slot. The bureaucracy people cursed became the scaffolding that kept the artery from choking in silence. Meanwhile, the losers learned to speak. Small operators formed a coalition, showing lawmakers how a widened basis and a missed tow emptied a town's tax base as surely as a plant closure. They didn't ask for special slots. They asked for clarity and a floor under chaos, notice before windows closed, relief dollars when rationing knocked bids off a cliff, and input when frameworks were drawn. What nobody knew at the time was how durable the rationing mindset would become. Once you normalize triage, you normalize asking who waits. That's a political habit with a long memory. Some seasons, the list will feel fair. Some, it won't. Either way, the river will be allocated in public, not assumed in private. Jake said it softly on a dark wheelhouse. Tell me the line and I'll live with it. Don't make me guess. Elise, staring at a bin fan readout she'd come to hate, answered the same way. If the river shrank, say so and say who moves first. I can plan around a hard truth. I can't plan around a rumor. The forecast, not if, but how often and how bad. 3 dry falls in 4 wasn't a fluke. It was the pattern asserting itself. Signals point to more frequent low-flow years, closer to every 3 to 5, with troughs that last weeks longer. Scenario boards map partial shutdowns, rolling convoys, draft caps to full corridor slowdowns when a cracked gate meets a salt wedge. Insurance priced it first. Credit followed, lifting deductibles, tightening lines. Shippers rewrote contracts around unreliability, earlier stems, split origins, penalties softened. Investments sniffed certainty and walked. This decision would matter for decades: rebuild for a smaller, jerkier river, or let capacity evaporate, inch by inch, into spreadsheets that never forgive. Resizing the Heartland, diversification and design for scarcity. The map didn't change, the math did. If the river is smaller than the economy it carries, the Heartland has to right size to what water, iron, and calendar can actually deliver, not retreat, recomposition. Elise felt it first in her ledger. The premium for certainty was worth more than the illusion of volume. Stakes first. Keep chasing the river we thought we had, and you burn cash on freight you can't count on, storage you can't turn, and contracts that punish lateness. Resize, and you protect margins by cutting the river's share of your risk. That choice decides which towns level off and which thin out. Action starts in the field. Crop mix shifts from what maximizes output to what minimizes river dependency at the worst moment. Corn acres that need fall fertilizer by barge and heavy bulk in harvest shift, a slice towards soy or specialty beans that tolerate rail better or feed a local crush. Sorghum creeps into marginal ground where a regional mill will take it steady. A co-op posts a premium for crops that fit a new interior flow. It isn't ideological, it's practical. Processing moves closer to where the crop grows. On the edge of a grain town, a mid-sized crush plant breaks ground, not to chase export beans, but to sell meal and oil into a regional arc that a train and a short barge hop can handle in any water year. An ethanol plant adds a sideline for sustainable aviation fuel feedstock because that buyer can lock multi-year offtake and pay for reliability. A flour mill upgrades an old rail spur and signs a service agreement with a short line revived by state loans. When the river pinches, these plants keep buying because their market sits within a truck loop or a 2-day rail move. Invest in interior intermodals becomes more than a talking point. Counties band together to fund a transload yard that aggregates grain for unit trains on a schedule Elise can live with. The Class I gets a guaranteed block daily. The yard gets predictable throughput. Crew training programs at the community college fill conductor and maintainer slots that railroads couldn't staff last drought. A short line that nearly died in the last decade paints locomotives and hires again, doing the unglamorous work of connecting towns to everything else. Pipeline corridors get real where they make sense. An old product line gets reversed and rehabbed to push diesel into a region that used to rely on barge drops every 2 weeks. A new ammonia pipeline proposal draws predictable heat, but the route is targeted, co-located with existing rights-of-way, paired with leak detection that silences some skeptics, matched to on-farm application co-ops that buy the molecule before it's in the ground. It takes years. It pays off for decades when a low river doesn't slow nitrogen. Demand-side shifts quietly amplify the effect. Elise joins a cooperative storage group, shared bin capacity with remote aeration controls that let them move air smarter and hold grain longer without losing quality. They pool risk and negotiate better power rates to run fans when it's cheapest. Hedging literacy becomes a survival skill, not a seminar. A younger farmer shows an older neighbor how to structure basis contracts that recognize river risk months out. A cluster of elevators forms a bargaining cooperative, spreading shipment risk across more than one belt and one berth. Resilience by design shows up in how towns rebuild. A river port invests in amphibious logistics, floating crane platforms that can work across a wider band of stages, adjustable fenders, moorings that ride low water without stranding, and backup shore power so a dredge can plug in and clear a cut at 3 a.m. without waiting for a generator. Yard layouts change, more cross-docking space to flip from barge to rail, more staging to smooth spikes. The Port Authority buys a second sonar unit and shares its depth readouts in real time with pilots and plans crews around the data, not hope. Nature-based buffers aren't charity, they're infrastructure. A county upstream takes federal and state money to set back a levee on a bend that feeds too much sand downstream. A farmer signs a contract to put a low field into a seasonal wetland that holds spring water, traps sediment, and bleeds it back in July. The deal includes a performance payment. If downstream gauges hold inches higher in late summer, the check gets bigger. It's a bet on biology that shows up as draft on a pilot's screen. From their perspective, the communities that move first stabilize first. A river town that fought a spoil site a decade ago now negotiates for a managed one, with a long-term fee that funds a school HVAC upgrade and a wildlife viewing area built on capped sand that tourists actually visit. A port that waited for state money in the last drought issues revenue bonds this time to build a flexible berth and backs it with a surcharge that shippers agree to because it keeps the gate open when gauges fall. A co-op that nearly broke on basis in the last low water leads a regional alliance that swaps trains and barges like chess pieces, cutting empty moves by a third. Micro-stories make the strategy concrete. Jake's company adds a shallow draft towboat and a pair of smaller barges designed to run thin water reaches that used to shut him down. He loses some capacity per trip, gains days per season, and sells reliability at a premium to customers who need timing more than volume. Elise signs a forward contract with a local plant that pays less than the best Gulf bid in fat years, but pays on time every week, drought or not. Her banker relaxes when the cash flow turns steady. The school board in her county votes to lease rooftop solar to power elevator fans during peak harvest, shaving operating cost and keeping bins cool when the grid stumbles. Small acts stacked. Technology plays the quiet part. Predictive depth tools on phones become as normal as weather apps. A machine vision camera on a tow scans the waterline on barges and alerts Jake before a scrape becomes a grounding. A state dot ties bridge weight sensors to truck appointment systems at elevators, so the two-lane road outside Elise's town doesn't clog with idling hoppers when a rail cut is late. Data sharing stops being theirs or ours and becomes what keeps the weak sane. There's a cultural pivot too. The story in coffee shops shifts from the river'll come back to plan for the smaller river. Pride doesn't vanish, it settles into new metrics. A co-op manager brags about keeping basis within a nickel of plan through a dry fall. A port director brags about near-zero unplanned closures. A mayor brags about a floodplain reconnection that saved 3 inches in August. The wins are inches, hours, and percentages, not headlines. None of this pretends the river will stop rationing. It builds a life around the rationing with fewer surprises and smaller crashes. It's diversification in place, designed for scarcity, and a willingness to trade some peak volume for durable throughput. That trade isn't defeat. It's how you keep Main Street from going dark when the gauge reads low. And after all this, one thing you can't pretend anymore is simple. We didn't inherit a river that can guarantee abundance. We inherited a constraint. The places that honor that reality early will write the rules everyone else lives under later. The meaning and the decision. We didn't lose the Mississippi, we outgrew it and refused to admit it until Inches wrote the bill. If you want the next chapter, how this ties to Panama's drought and the Arctic's opening lanes, watch the next video. Subscribe to stay with these hidden arteries that decide who eats and who pays.